So I guess, how do I get started? We're gonna focus on the third meditation today, but maybe we should do a little bit of review, just to sort of, I guess, bring our memory back to speed where we left off. We are still, if we're following Descartes' line of thought, we're still in a pretty uncomfortable situation because, even though I guess you could say in the second meditation, he feels like he's demonstrated that he is absolutely certain of his own existence, the existence of his mind, that his mind is something that could never be doubted, his thought. Maybe his body is an illusion. Maybe everything else is an illusion. But the one thing he knows for sure is his mind. And everything else he knows through his mind. And this is sort of his rationalist position. His understanding is the basis for his knowledge. And we covered the wax example in the last lecture. And he tries to demonstrate that, by observing the wax and looking at the wax and reflecting on the things that I know about the wax, it's apparent that my knowledge of the wax is not based on my senses, and it's not based on my imagination either. It's based on my understanding, says Descartes. But as I was saying at the outset, he's still in a pretty difficult situation now, because for all he knows, at least at this moment, for all he knows, there is no wax. There is nothing else. All there is are his thoughts, and nothing else. Everything that he sees and feels and experiences is just in his mind. He doesn't want to believe that. He wants to believe in the reality of some external world out there besides just his thoughts. But remember, in the first meditation, he entertains this evil genius hypothesis. And so, for all he knows, and again, I'll read this quote from the third meditation that sort of points this out. He doesn't really believe this. He doesn't really believe in an evil genius, but he can't really come up with any proof that it's wrong. And so until he can somehow disprove this theory, he's got to sort of remain a skeptic. He's got to basically say, well, for all I know, it's all just a deception. Evil genius is tricking me. Everything's a lie, well, except for my own existence, right? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. I can't deny that, but that's not much to know. I'm a thinking thing. Wow. I think, I will, I doubt, etc. That's not much. I want to know about the world out there. I can't do that, Descartes thinks, until I somehow show that God exists. And if I can show that God exists and that God is not a deceiver, then this evil genius hypothesis, it goes away. I can basically assert that it's an impossibility. There's no way that an evil genius could exist in the same universe that a good, benevolent God could exist. And I think last time we met, some of y'all were pushing back on this. I'd be interested. Think about this. I've always, again, I'm not even a believer. Like, I'm not a religious person, but I kind of get his logic here. But some of y'all were iffy about it at the last meeting. I kind of understand what the connection is. I buy it. I'm like, okay, well, if there were a God who was good and caring and loving, it doesn't seem, perhaps there is a reason, but it doesn't seem to me like that'd be a good thing to do, to create something that was constantly deceived. And so he says, that's not fair, that's not just. God would not allow that to happen. So if God exists, evil genius couldn't exist. That's not to say that I'm not sometimes deceived. That's not to say that I'm not sometimes capable of error. He'll deal with that issue in the fourth meditation. But the idea that I'm always deceived and everything that I believe is false, that's a very questionable position to be put in by your creator. why would the creator do that? That doesn't seem like a very just and good thing to do. Now, again, maybe some of y'all have some reasonings. Maybe you could write your second paper on this. You could critique his reasoning and be like, well, actually, maybe it actually God would let the evil genius exist, and it would actually be a good thing. I don't see how it would be, but maybe. I don't know. Um, I think you have to get pretty creative to make that argument. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but you'd have to get real creative. Like, what would be the justification for lying to some person who didn't deserve it, didn't do anything? All they did was get created, and you're deceiving them and lying to them about everything about their being. Maybe there is, a reason why that would be good, but he's assuming it's not. So the focus of this lecture of the third meditation is going to be proving that such a deity, that God, exists. And then very early on in the fourth meditation, he is going to argue that God has to be good, that God could not be a deceiver. And so we probably won't talk about that second part until we meet again for our next lecture. But the first proof that he offers for the existence of God, we will get to today. But it's a very roundabout way. I think we actually got started on this. If you were able to watch the last lecture that I posted, we actually got a little bit of a start on let me back up a bit here. We got a little bit of a start here on the third meditation. And it's weird because, and I'm probably going to repeat myself a bit, but it's weird the way he goes about, I don't know what else word to use, but weird. Maybe a better word would be unintuitive. It's very unintuitive, counterintuitive, the way he approaches proof for God's existence. For about 3 or 4 pages, you're kind of like, wait, I thought the title of the third meditation was concerning God, that he exists. Why are you spending all this time talking about ideas, judgments, willing, affects, and things? This seems to be a distraction, a digression, but it's not. We'll see fairly shortly, like I said, after a few pages, and I'm going to skip quite a bit so we can get to kind of the heart of the matter. Then it becomes pretty clear what the heck any of this has to do with proving that God exists. Let me read that passage, though, that I was referring to earlier, where he brings up the evil genius hypothesis, not by name, but he alludes to it. And this is on page, let me find it, 25. If you have this book, if you have a different version, sometimes the margins will have numbers in them, and those numbers, I think, refer to the original publication and the original page numbers in the Latin. And so this one is right above 37 if you're looking at the margins, but it's page 25 in our textbook. But he says, this is sort of the last few sentences there at the bottom of that paragraph. He says, because I have no reason for thinking there is a God who is a deceiver, and of course I do not yet sufficiently know whether there is even a God, the basis for doubting, right, the basis for, believing in this evil genius hypothesis, depending on, as it does merely on that hypothesis, is very tenuous. So this skepticism that he has about doubting everything is very tenuous. It's temporary and, so to speak, metaphysical. This is something I think a lot of students get wrong about Descartes. They read this and they hear the lectures and they're like, this guy's nuts. He didn't believe in his own existence. Yeah, Lola.
Excuse me. Yes, sir. What page is that on, please?
It's on page 25. Page 25. It's pretty close to the bottom, about 2/3 of the way down.
Okay.
There's a sentence where he says, and certainly, comma, He says, and certainly because I have no reason for thinking there is a God who's a deceiver. Of course, I don't even know that there's a God yet, but the basis for doubting, he says, is depending on this hypothesis. It depends on,
I don't see
again,
that.
the evil genius hypothesis. Uh, and that's very tenuous, so to speak. It's metaphysical. In order to remove, even this basis for doubt, um, I should at the very first opportunity inquire whether there is a God, and if there is, whether or not he can be a deceiver. For if I'm ignorant of this, it appears I'm never capable of being completely certain about anything else. Right? So until I can prove that God exists, I kind of have to assume that it could all be deception. Except for the one thing, remember, the one thing that he could never be deceived about, his own mind, right? I think, therefore I exist. I think, therefore I am. You know, that he doesn't need to prove God exists for that one. But that's not much to know. I want to know that the world exists. I want to know that my body exists. I want to know that all this other stuff exists and that I'm not being deceived. And so for him now, I guess he's got to go ahead and do this. He's got to provide us with the proof for God's existence, and he's going to do that. Um, I don't want to get y'all all excited. I think I mentioned this at the end of my lecture last time. His proof for God's existence is I would say not the greatest. He offers more than one, so we'll see a few others later on when we get to I think the fifth meditation. But to be fair, I think most arguments for or against the existence of God, they're usually pretty weak. So, but how does he go about this? He starts, and this I touched on at the very end of the last lecture I posted. Um, he starts by talking about ideas, right? The nature of ideas. And when he uses this term idea, when he uses the term thought, when I'm thinking, my thoughts, my ideas, I think he has in mind something much more broad than you probably do, than most of us probably do. When we hear the word idea or the word thought, we're thinking of maybe some inner voice in our head talking to ourselves, imagining things. Those are thoughts. Those are ideas. But Descartes is widening, I think, the meaning or the connotation of the word thought. For him, it's all experience. So me grabbing this bottle and feeling the cold and feeling, the moisture seeping through the plastic and taking a sip, these are all considered a part of my conscious experience. And so they're all included under thought, under ideas. And so you got to keep this in mind when you're reading Descartes and he's making all of these claims about thoughts and ideas. So let's just real briefly here look at this image that I've, found on the internet through some Google image search. We've got the typical conundrum, the typical problem that the modern philosopher faces. Here we are, a subjectivity, a thinking thing. We've got that. We know we're here. We know we exist. And we're experiencing what seems to be an object out there. In this instance, the guy's looking at a tree. Now, there's this object that's assumed to be out there, separate from me. Light waves are bouncing off of the tree. They're hitting my retina. They're, entering into my optic nerve. All of these signals are being processed in my brain, and I'm having this experience of a tree. Okay, so I'm having this thought. So how do I know that my experience, all this stuff up here in the thought bubble, how do I know that my experience of this object is actually accurate, that it actually conforms to the actual object? This is a question that Descartes poses for the first time here in the third meditation, or maybe I missed it. Maybe he did pose it earlier in the essay and I somehow overlooked it. But he explicitly poses this question here. You'll see it in a minute when I read the next quote I have marked. But he doesn't answer it until the very end of the essay. He doesn't really explain, why is it, how can I know that my experience of the world is anything like the actual world out there? At this point, though, he's just sort of in his head, right? But okay, that's fine. That's fine. We're going to get there eventually. We'll get there when we get to the sixth meditation. But even if we just keep to our ideas, Descartes seems to think that ideas in and of themselves can never be false. So whether I'm having an idea of, I don't know, maybe I'm having an idea of what I'm having for lunch later today, or I'm thinking about that steak I bought and I'm going to grill it, right? Or whether I'm having an idea of a purple unicorn, okay? Both of those ideas, Descartes are going to say, are true. It's true that I'm having that idea. It's true that I'm having the idea of the steak. It's true that I'm having an idea of a purple unicorn. Whether or not there actually is a steak waiting for me, whether there actually is a unicorn, that's, beside the point. The ideas considered in themselves strictly as ideas are not false. They are truly what they are. My idea of orange is the idea of orange, and so on and so forth. He says the same thing about what he calls the will, or the affects. I suppose by the affects he means our emotions, our fears, our desires, our drives, that sort of thing. And our will is our choices, our decisions, how we guide our actions. And he says that those can't be false either. Uh, I can make bad choices with my will. I can make what might be considered immoral or unethical choices with my will. I might have maybe bad affects. I might have bad emotions, hatred, lust, things like this that are considered bad. But considered as a will or considered as an emotion in itself, it's true that I'm having that emotion. It's true that I'm having that will. So for him, ideas, the will, the affects, those can't be false. Those are just true as they are. It's only when we make judgments that falsehood is possible. So let's read how he explains this in his own words. This is at the very, very bottom of page 25. It's that last line, the very, very last line. It starts a new paragraph. He says, now, as far as ideas are concerned, if they are considered alone and in their own right, without being referred to something else, they cannot, properly speaking, be false. For whether it is a she-goat or a chimera that I'm imagining, it is no less true that I imagine the one than the other. Moreover, we need not fear that there is falsity in the will itself or in the affects. For although I can choose evil things, or even things that are utterly non-existent, I cannot conclude from this that it is untrue that I do choose these things. Thus there remain only judgments, in which I must take care not to be mistaken. Now the principal and the most frequent error to be found in judgments consists in the fact that I judge that the ideas which are in me are similar to or in conformity with certain things outside me. Obviously, if I were to consider these ideas merely as modes of thought and were not to refer them to anything else, they could hardly give me any subject matter for error. So it's only when I make a judgment, and the primary error in the judgment, he says, is when I judge the things that I experience, my experience of the thing, like in this image, the experience of the tree, I assume that that experience conforms to the actual tree. But sometimes I'm wrong about that. Sometimes I look out at the world and I'm like, oh, that's a tree, and I walk up closer to it, and I don't know. It's a fake tree. It's a plastic tree. Excuse me, I'm getting the hiccups all of a sudden. It's a cardboard cutout of a tree or something like that. That's when falsity is introduced. That's when error is introduced. Um, so ultimately, he's going to try to determine whether his idea of God, right now we're back to the main topic. I'm kind of jumping ahead, by the way. He doesn't get to the punchline for much longer. But he has to figure out how does the idea of God fit in this scheme. I obviously have an idea of God. That's when I've got God, the word God, capital G in quotation marks. That's the idea of God, let's say. So the quotation marks. This is the idea. Nobody denies that the idea of God exists. That's true in Descartes' language. Even if you're an atheist, even if you're an unbeliever, you still know the concept. You might not believe that there is such a thing, but you know what it means when someone uses the term God. So the idea. Now, Descartes has to somehow prove that this idea corresponds to an actual being, that this idea corresponds to something out there in the universe. And he thinks he can do this. He thinks he's going to be able to do this, and we'll see. You be the judge. Um, but he pauses here again. This is very indirect. It's a very roundabout way. I promise you, he's going to get to his proof soon enough. But before he does this, he kind of makes this observation, which it's an observation that I referred to earlier. The issues that are at hand, the problems that we're facing when we're dealing with our experience and its conformity with reality. How do I know that the way I experience things is the way things really are? He brings up this problem, and he brings up some of the issues and the objections to obvious answers that we would give to this problem. So let's read here on page 26. This is, it's right in the middle of the page. It's that third paragraph, or really the second full paragraph. He says, here I must inquire particularly into those ideas that I believe to be derived from things existing outside of me. Just what reason do I have for believing that these ideas resemble those things? So, again, remember when he uses the word idea, he's using it pretty broadly here. Okay, any experience I have, any idea I have, what about the ones that I feel originate or derive, is the word he used, derive from things outside me? When I look to my left here and I see this water bottle, I don't assume that that experience of the water bottle comes from me. I'm assuming that it's coming from something out there. There's something out there that because it exists, because it's real, I look at it and it's there. I didn't create it. It's not like the purple unicorn I was talking about earlier, where obviously I would have to like think of that myself and picture it in my mind. Um, Even the steak, I guess you could say, would be something like that, because like the steak is in the other room. I'm thinking about the steak. I'm starting to get hungry just thinking about it. I'm like, want to get that grill fired up as soon as this class is over. I should stop thinking about the steak because it might make me be not as good of a teacher. I'll be rushing to get through the lecture so we can end early. But he says, so let's just forget about those ideas, the ones that like obviously come from me. Let's focus on these ideas that are assumed to originate from something external to me, like when I'm looking at a tree, like this guy in the picture, or when I'm looking at the water bottle. And he asked, well, what reason do I have? What reason do I have for believing that the things that these ideas, that, my little experience, the thought bubble up here, what reason do I have for believing that my experience resembles the thing? And he gives an answer, but you're going to see in a minute he doesn't like the answer. He's like, well, this is one thing that's kind of confusing about philosophy. Not all philosophers do this, but a lot of them do. They'll kind of give the obvious answer at first. They'll be like, oh, this is probably why. And then they'll show, but I was wrong. And then they'll tear it apart and give you the real answer. This is something that, like I said, not all philosophers do it, but it's a part of definitely Descartes' style. Aristotle is another philosopher who comes to mind like this. So he says, all right, well, why do I think that this bottle of water actually looks the way it appears to me? If I was an insect and I was staring at the bottle, it would look different. Why do I think that my experience is true or closer to the truth than the insect or a dog or some other animal? He says, well, I do seem to have been taught so by nature. So it seems like I have a natural instinct. I naturally think that the things that appear to be outside of me actually are outside of me. Is that a good enough reason? He says, moreover, I do know from experience that these ideas do not depend on my will, nor consequently upon myself, for I often notice them even against my will. So he's given us a couple reasons here. One, I kind of naturally think that they exist. I just have an instinct, a predisposition to believe that this bottle of water is actually there, or that the tree's actually there if I'm staring at it. It's not necessarily something in my mind. So there's an instinct. I'm taught by nature, as he puts it. And the second reason that he's bringing up here is, well, it's not dependent on my will. I'm gonna, if I look to my left, I'm gonna see that bottle of water whether I want to or not. I don't decide to see it. When I'm walking down the street and I look to my right at someone's yard and I notice they have a tree, I don't decide to see the tree. It's there whether I want to or not. So are those good enough reasons? He says, for example, whether or not I will it, I feel heat right now. Whether I want to feel heat or not, I do. If I get close to the fire. The next paragraph, he writes, I will now see whether these reasons are powerful enough. So are they? He's going to say no. Why not? What's wrong with these reasons? I've got an instinct, and these things exist against my will. Whether I want to see them or not, they're there. What's the problem with these two rationalizations? He says, well, when I say I've been taught so by nature, all I have in mind is that I'm driven by a spontaneous impulse to believe this. And again, I guess that instincts is perhaps what he's talking about. Spontaneous impulse to believe something. And not that some light of nature is showing me that it is true. I personally have a big issue with this passage because of this distinction. If you're confused right now, there's a good reason for that, I would say. Let me back up here. What he just has done, he said, okay, well, I've been taught by nature. That means that there's a spontaneous impulse to believe something. But that's not, he's going to say, that's not the same thing as, let me get his wording correct here, not that some light of nature is showing me that it is true, right? Shown by the light of nature. He doesn't really, in my estimation, you could maybe defend him. If you think he's got a good distinction here, you could write your paper about this and prove me wrong. I'd be happy to read that paper. But as far as I'm concerned, as I'm concerned, and maybe I'm just not looking hard enough, he doesn't really explain this distinction very well. What's the difference between being taught by nature and being shown by the light of nature? He seems to want to well, doesn't seem, it's pretty obvious, he wants to discredit the first one. That's something that can be dismissed. Our instincts. Like, we have an instinct to eat sugary food. It tastes really good. But if you eat a lot of sugar, that ain't healthy. So there, that's definitely my, sometimes my instincts can lead me astray. But then this other category, which he doesn't really do, I argue, I don't think he does a good job of really explaining what's different about it. This other category, shown by the light of nature, not taught by nature, but shown by the light of nature, this can never be doubted. And he'll give us examples in this essay of things that he thinks are shown by the light of nature. One of them we've already seen. Can anybody guess what it is? What's something that is shown by the light of nature that he knows is true? He could never doubt it. His own existence, right? Cogito ergo sum. He thinks that the cogito, the thinking thing, the fact that I'm thinking and therefore I must be existing, that is shown by the light of nature. Whereas my belief that objects exist outside of me is taught by nature. It's an instinct. It's not shown by the light of nature. This bothers the hell out of me. If it bothers you, I think you're rightly so, rightly so. He seems to use this quite a bit as kind of I don't want to say a get out of jail free card. That's a bit, but it's kind of just this sort of like, if I want to assert that it's true, I'm just going to say this about it, and you can't argue against that. You can't argue against this light of nature. Let's read what he says. He does do a little bit to explain it. I personally just don't think he's very convincing and very clear, and it still seems to me like there's not much difference between these two things. But he says, when I say I've been taught by nature, all I have in mind is I'm driven by a spontaneous impulse to believe this, not that some light of nature is showing me that it is true. These are two very different things. For whatever is shown me by this light of nature, for example, that from the fact that I doubt, it follows that I am, and the like, this cannot in any way be doubtful. So things that are shown by the light of nature can never be doubtful. They're undoubtable. Okay? This is owing to the fact that there can be no other faculty that I can trust as much as this light. Why? He seems to just assert that. Well, the reason is because this is the one thing I trust. I can trust this. Why? Why can you trust this? All right. There's no other faculty that I can trust as much. Based on what? He doesn't give us any reasons. As far as I can see. Again, maybe a better reader of Descartes can teach me otherwise. I'm open to that. But as far as natural impulses are concerned, in the past, I've often judged myself to have driven by them to make the poorer choice when it was a question of choosing a good. And I fail to see why I should place any greater faith in them than in other matters. Honestly, I think I'm trying to help him actually here. It seems to me like he's making actually a difference between things that I do spontaneously that apply to actions and things that I intuitively believe that don't apply to any actions, that are just completely abstract, like the fact that I exist. I can assert that my own existence. That doesn't really affect anything about my existence. That doesn't change how I act. Wow, you exist. That's really going to change your life. You already knew it. stupid, right? I'm being a bit informal here. But to me, I'm like, Descartes, you're really just not, you're not distinguishing between anything um, that's, I mean, the distinction he's making, I don't think is the distinction that he thinks he's making. He thinks he's making this distinction between what is undoubtable, unassailable, because there's no way to deny it, and something that is basically just thought to be true because we're hardwired that way. And I think that those are basically two descriptions, you could argue, for the same thing. Maybe this is me reading Nietzsche too much. We'll get to Nietzsche later this semester. He has, he tends to think that um, even reason itself, rationalizing and using our minds to understand things, that itself is an instinct, that itself can't be divorced from our sort of biological being. But he's going to say, look, the fact that I've been taught by nature, the fact that I have a spontaneous impulse to believe that the things are outside of me, that's not good enough. And maybe he does have a good argument. Like, maybe that's true. Like, just because you naturally are inclined to believe something, that's not evidence it's true. But I still don't like this distinction he makes. Right? I still don't like this. Well, if it were shown by the light of nature, we could assert that it's true. But since it's taught by nature, we throw it out. But what about this other argument? Obviously, I don't create my reality. I don't tell myself to see a bottle of water when I look to my left. I just see it. So it's there. It doesn't depend on my will. So what does he say to that? Well, he says, although these ideas do not depend upon my will, it does not follow that they necessarily proceed from things existing outside me. For just as these impulses about which I spoke just now seem to be different from my will, right? When I have a natural instinct, like I feel a desire, it doesn't seem like I decided to have desire. I just did. I have this impulse. My will decides what to do with that and how to act on it, he's going to say. But whether or not I feel lust or indifference or whatever, that's something that just comes to me from somewhere else. So just as these impulses I spoke of seem to be different from my will, even though they're in me, so too perhaps there is also in me some other faculty, one not yet sufficiently known to me, which produces these ideas. Just as it has always seemed up to now that ideas are formed in me without any help from external things when I'm asleep. He's talking about his dreams again. So when I'm dreaming, I don't, it doesn't seem like I'm causing the dream. I'm just sleeping. I'm having a dream. You don't hear people talk about making a dream or creating a dream. They have a dream. It's passive. You have a dream. But the dream comes from within you, it's in your mind. So he's using the same sort of logic. He's saying, well, sure, that tree that I'm looking at seems to come from outside of me, but that's when I'm sleeping, my dreams seem to come from outside of me. They seem to not be in my control. So this isn't really a good argument either. Maybe I actually am causing my own experience and I don't even freaking know it. And finally, even if these ideas did proceed from things other than myself, it does not therefore follow that they resemble those things. So how do I even know that the tree looks like I think it looks? It might look more like a banana or a pineapple or a rutabaga, or whatever. Why do I think the world actually is as it appears? Indeed, it seems I frequently have noticed a vast difference in many respects. For example, and he's going to give us another example here, which you could argue he's killing two birds with one stone, just like he did in the previous meditation. When he gave us the wax example was supposed to be a demonstration of how the mind is better known than the body. Excuse me. But also, it is supposed to demonstrate Descartes' rationalism. Remember, he's a rationalist. He's not a skeptic. He's a rationalist. He thinks that all knowledge is based on reason. And so the wax example from the second meditation, if you remember from the previous lecture, is supposed to demonstrate that my knowledge of the wax can only be explained in terms of my understanding. My senses alone could not know all the things that I know about the wax. My imagination alone could not know all the things I know about the wax. I must have understanding. I must have reason, the ability to understand concepts. So this example is similar. He's talking about uh, ideas. He's talking about whether they proceed from me or from something else. Now he's talking about whether the ideas in my mind resemble the actual thing out there. So when I'm having an experience of the tree, how accurate is my idea of the tree? How much does it correspond to the actual tree? Now he's going to give us an example of the sun to kind of demonstrate that my senses, my physical experience of the sun, is actually going to be false, and closer to the truth is going to be my rational understanding of it. So, this is sort of bringing the skepticism. How do I know that my experience of the thing approximates the thing? Well, actually, I don't. And two, I actually get closer to the thing through my calculation, through reasoning, through understanding, not through observation. Okay, so how's he going to argue for this with this example of the sun? Let's read the passage right where I left off. He says, for example, I find within myself two distinct ideas of the sun. What's he talking about? Well, he says the first. Sorry, I lost myself. Where's he at? One idea, the first idea, is drawn, as it were, from the senses. Now, it is this idea, which of all those that I take to be derived from outside me, that is in the most need of examination. So the idea, again, you got to open your mind here a bit and realize he's using the word idea very broadly here. My experience, I would rather him use the word experience here. My experience of the sun. When I'm actually standing outside on a hot, sunny day, that's one idea for Descartes. And according to that idea, he says, by means of this idea, the sun appears to me to be quite small. Okay? So imagine if you didn't know about astronomy and you didn't know how big the sun was, and you never went to school, you grew up in a culture that didn't really have any scientific knowledge or much about the universe. How big do you think the sun would seem to you? And how far away from the earth do you think it would be? Like, if you had to guess, somebody's like, how far do you think that sun is from earth? Like, how far would you guess? I don't even know the answer. Like, I mean, it's what, probably hundreds, maybe thousands of light years. If someone wants to Google it, go ahead, right? But it's like light years away from the earth. I had a student in my class at yesterday. She guessed, she's like, I'd probably guess like 500 miles, And I'm like, I probably would have guessed even closer, if I was just guessing how far the sun was and I wasn't a scientist and I was just some farmer back in 400 BC or something, and someone's like, how far is the sun from the earth? I'm like, I don't know, who cares? Why do you need to know that? I'm just curious, what do you think? How far is it? I don't know, 50 miles? I probably would have guessed 50 miles. If it's 500 miles, you wouldn't be able to see it, right? I mean, can you see cities? Cities are huge. But if a city is 500 miles away, you can't just look 500 miles north and see the city. So how could the sun be 500 miles away? It's probably closer. It's probably 50 miles, right? That is so wrong, right? Obviously, the sun is way, way further away from Earth than 50 miles. And it's much bigger than it actually appears. So this first idea, that, as Descartes calls it, of the sun is very incorrect. And that's the one that seems to actually derive from outside of me. But there's another idea that's more in me, that's more to do with my mind and my understanding, that is actually closer to the truth, he says. There is another idea, one that is derived from astronomical reasoning, rationalism, reasoning. That is, it is elicited from certain notions that are innate in me, right? So he thinks certain notions, certain ideas are just innate. We have an innate ability to comprehend mathematics. We have an innate capacity to comprehend geometrical truth. We have an innate capacity to understand our existence and that we exist just by thinking. And so those are innate. And that astronomical reasoning in me that's innate tells me other things about the sun besides what my senses are reporting. Through this idea, the sun is shown to be several times larger than the earth. Both ideas surely cannot resemble the same sun existing outside me, and reason convinces me that the idea that seems to have emanated from the sun, right, the actual physical experience of the sun from so close, is the very one that least resembles it. Now, this is ironic. The one that seems to be more closely attached to my actual experience of the sun is the one that's actually furthest from the truth. When I actually experience the sun physically, it seems like it's close, especially on a hot, sunny day. It seems smaller than it is. Thank you, Lola. She looked it up. 92.847 million miles, right? 50 miles, 50 miles, you know? I mean, what would you guess? I mean, I think 50 miles would be pretty, like reasonable. I mean, if you're just going on like how far it seems, but boy, am I off. You know, my other student said 500 miles, and but she was even. I mean, she was closer, but not much. We're talking about almost 100 million miles from Earth. So uh, let's see. Another way occurs. Like, I'm gonna skip. No, I'm not gonna skip because this is kind of important. We're getting close to the end of class, darn it, and I'm like, we're hardly even like halfway to his proof for God's existence. There's this. Okay, this is a long paragraph I'm gonna get through. This is probably all we're gonna have time for today, but this paragraph that I'm about to read, this is the bottom page 27. It's vague. It's very unclear, but um, honestly, if you read it carefully, you could probably guess, if you think about it hard enough, you could probably guess how he's going to get to a proof for God's existence. It's definitely not obvious. Like I said, this is not a very clear passage, very obscure, but he kind of lays the groundwork, you're going to see in a moment, for his proof. He's kind of laying out the framework that's going to kind of set up his proof for God's existence. So let's read it again. This is the bottom page 27, the last paragraph. He says, still another way occurs to me for inquiring whether some of the things of which there are ideas in me do exist outside me. Insofar as these ideas are merely modes of thought, I see no inequality among them. Okay, so whether I have an idea of the delicious steak that I'm going to grill later today, or whether I have an idea of a purple unicorn, or whether I have an idea of God, uh, these ideas are not any different insofar as they are ideas, insofar as they are modes of thought. But insofar as one idea represents one thing and another idea another thing, it is obvious that they do differ very greatly from one another. So insofar as they're ideas, they don't differ, but insofar as they are ideas of a certain thing, they do differ. And some ideas are different from others in that regard. The idea of God is different from the idea of a steak that I'm going to grill on the grill later today. The idea of a triangle, the idea of a purple hippopotamus, those are different. Okay, they're distinct things with distinct qualities. Unquestionably, those ideas that display substances, to me, are something more, and if I may say so, contain within themselves more objective reality than those which represent only modes or accidents. Okay, let me find, I think I have a slide with all this stuff already, and I know I don't. Okay, let's just use this slide here. So he says ideas that display substances. Okay, so some ideas display substances versus ideas, as he puts it, that represent only modes or accidents. Okay. Okay, so a lot of the terminology that he's using here in this paragraph, substance, modes, accidents, objective reality, um, he's gonna, he's using these terms and kind of assuming that you know what he's talking about, which is really unfair for intro to philosophy students. This is a good essay otherwise for intro, but the word substance, he's drawing from the philosophical tradition, the term mode, accident, objective reality. These need to be explained. So when I have an idea of something that displays a substance to me, he's not really clear what he means here, but I'm assuming based on what that word means in the history of philosophy, that he has something like this in mind. When he talks about an idea that displays a substance, it is something that seems to actually have, I hate to use the word substance because that's a circular definition, but it seems to have actual existence independent of anything else. The way that Aristotle defines substance is probably the most helpful here. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, he talked about substance in many different ways, but one way he defined it was substance is always the subject, never the predicate. So when you're looking at a sentence, a substance is always the subject and it has things predicated of it, what you would call a mode or an accident. So for instance, I, Travis, am a substance. I'm always the subject. Travis is always the subject of the sentence, and there are modes and accidents that attach to me, like having facial hair. If I go into the next room and shave my beard, I would still be Travis. I would still be a substance. That accident, having a beard, or the mode, me sitting down, standing up, being happy, being fat, being skinny, whatever, those don't change the underlying substance that the modes attach to. Okay, so that's, again, that's the traditional distinction between a substance and an accident or a mode or a predicate or a quality. There's a lot of different technical terms that different philosophers use for the same thing. So he's saying that if an idea, like the idea of Travis, your idea of me, Professor Ross, however you think of me, that, as he says, has more objective reality, than has more objective reality and is something more and real than ideas of modes and accidents. So apparently, the idea of Travis, the idea of Professor Ross, has more objective reality than the idea of a beard or the idea of being fat or skinny or purple or yellow or whatever color, right? Those ideas, where's he getting this from? He just asserts it. He's just asserting it, right? Uh, Unquestionably, he says. Okay, just because you say it's without question, no one will deny. Just because you start a sentence with unquestionably, just because you start a sentence with no one will deny, just because you start a sentence with it's obviously the case, that doesn't mean that what follows that is obviously the case. Okay, just for your information. I get really angry when I read this in journalism all the time, like when I'm reading articles in the news. It's so obvious. I'm like, is it? Is it really? Well, I guess I'm an idiot because it's not obvious to me. Would you please explain to this moron over here? So don't do that in your paper, right? Unless it is obvious, right? Like it's obvious that a square has four sides because that's how you define a freaking square, right? But most of the time it's not. He's like, unquestionably, he says, ideas that display substances uh, contain within themselves more objective reality than those which represent only modes or accidents. Again, the idea, now he's going to finally get to God here, the idea that enables me to understand a supreme deity, eternal, infinite, omniscient, omnipotent, and creator of all things other than himself, clearly has more objective reality within it than do those ideas through which finite substances are displayed. Um, Now, indeed, it is evident by the light of nature that there must be at least as much reality in the efficient and total cause as there is in the effect of that same cause. From whence, I ask, can effect get its reality if not from its cause? And how could the cause give that reality to the effect unless it also possessed that reality? Hence, it follows that something cannot come into being out of nothing, and also that what is more perfect, that is, what contains in itself more reality, cannot come into being from what is less perfect. Okay, a lot to unpack there. But let's first, we've got like 4 minutes left, so I don't have much time to do this. Let's first, before we get to uh, the principle of sufficient reason that he just kind of spit out there, let's get clear what does he mean by objective reality, and what is the difference between objective reality um, and actual or formal reality. I honestly think he should have used the term formal reality for what he calls objective reality. I think the terminology to me is kind of confusing. Objective reality for him is it has reality as an idea, right? And so all things, insofar as I'm experiencing them, have some objective reality. Whether I'm having an idea of God, whether I'm having an idea of a sandwich, whether I'm having an idea of a purple unicorn, those all have objective reality. He's going to say that the idea of God has more objective reality because it's more perfect, better. Uh, but it's still an idea. It's still an object to a subject, to a subjectivity. Whether or not that idea corresponds to an actual thing, that is a question he still hasn't answered yet, right? That's the question of formal or actual reality. What we think of when we hear the word reality. Does it really freaking exist? Um, so he's saying, look, an idea that displays substance to me, like the idea of Professor Ross, or even better yet for him, an even more perfect idea, the idea of God, that has more objective reality than another idea, like the idea of a beard or the idea of a whisker, or whatever. Um, and now we move on to the next point. Let's just give them all that. Let's just say, all right, so some ideas are different from others. Some are more objectively real than others. What does this have to do with what's actually real? What's actually real out there? And this brings us to Descartes' usage, and I would argue misusage, of the old principle of sufficient reason. What is the principle of sufficient reason? He pretty much explained it in that last quote that I read, but he did it in a very unclear, convoluted way. Surprise, surprise. But basically, the principle of sufficient reason, goes back again to Aristotle. maybe even further you could argue, but Aristotle was the first to explicitly sort of formulate it. Um, the principle basically says that for anything that exists, for anything that is, it had to have a reason for existing. There had to be some reason why it's there. It had to be caused by something. It made sense, whatever. But so for anything that exists, it had to be caused. There had to be a reason for it, and that reason had to be sufficient. It had to be enough. So if I had an 80-pound, let's say I have an 80-pound dumbbell, okay. I made a dumbbell, right? Like I'm a steel worker, and I made a mold, and I made a dumbbell because I'm going to sell fitness equipment, right? In order to make an 80-pound dumbbell out of iron, I have to have at least 80 pounds of iron. I have to have at least 80 pounds of material and rubber and whatever, material I'm using to make the dumbbell. If I only have 30 pounds of iron, I can't make an 80-pound dumbbell. So if the 80-pound dumbbell exists, 80 pounds of iron had to exist, or steel, or whatever metal they're making it with, right? So this is the idea, right? Whatever exists came about from some reason. Something made it, something caused it, and whatever caused it must be enough, must be sufficient. Okay. I have an idea of God. It exists. Whatever caused that idea of God had to be enough. It had to be sufficient. This might give you a little bit of a hint where he's going with this argument, but I barely started on this argument, and so we'll have to wait till next time. Unfortunately, this week, well, maybe fortunately, we all need a break, so maybe I should say fortunately, this week is short. This is the only day we're meeting, is today. Thursday is a holiday for us at TSU. We're taking a early weekend for the Easter holiday. So I hope you guys have a great weekend, but we're going to have to sort of expand on what I find problematic, and not just me, other philosophers as well, find problematic about his use of this principle of sufficient reason. And we'll look at his argument. How does he use it to establish the proof for God's existence? So it's 12:15, so I better go ahead and stop there. I just hit sharing, and now my computer has frozen up. Okay, now I'm back. Okay, cool. Let me stop recording.